It is good to have you all here. My name is Mike Kinman. I'm the rector here. My pronouns are he, him. It is a joy to have everyone here at All Saints Church. So come on in, grab a seat, grab a cup of coffee or something. Everyone turn and wave at the camera. We want to say hi to everyone who's streaming online. Great to have you here. Want to make sure everybody knows that after the forum, we want you to hit two tables really hard. The first one is our action table. At all times, we put our faith into action at All Saints Church. Right now, this week, we're asking everyone to write our senators and your representative to support something called the People's Budget. It's being put together by the Congressional Progressive Caucus. It really embodies the ideals of the Poor People's Campaign, which Dr. King started in the 60s and which Bishop William Barber and Tracy Blackman and others have picked up since then. It really looks at our budget as a moral document, which it is, and it includes the tenets of the Green New Deal and looking at really how our budget can reflect our care for those who are most vulnerable. So please stop by the action table and sign that letter to both of our senators and to your representative. Want to let you know that we are deeply appreciative of the financial gifts that keep this community going, along with so many of the efforts of the people here and the grace and power of God. Many of you have major pledges for 2019. We still have a good number of pledges out. We really need to get all those in this week. The vestry is meeting to consider the 2019 budget. We need to have all the pledges in. And we still have a considerable gap to close to get to where we want to be for the 2019 budget. So if you have made your pledge, thank you so much. If you haven't, we can get you a pledge card. You can pledge online. Those of you who are streaming online, you can click the donate button. You can donate and make a gift now. You can also go to a page where you can fill out a pledge card to pledge your support for the mission and ministry of All Saints Church this year. Need to do that this week. So thank you very much for doing that. I mentioned a second table that I hope that you'll stop by, and that's over here. We've got some books for sale this morning, and they're phenomenal books. The first is Ferguson and Faith, Sparking Leadership and Awakening Community. You heard Leah Gunning-Francis, many of you who are just coming from the 9 o'clock service preaching. This is a phenomenal book for someone who was on the ground in Ferguson, relaying the stories of what happened in that uprising and the theology and faith that sprung from it. So please, we did a Lenten book study on this book last year, so some of you have read this already. Please, you can pick up a copy of this. And the second is a book by our speaker, and I will introduce it as a way of introducing him. It's a book called Acting White, ? Rethinking Race in, quote, Post-Racial, unquote, America. It is by our forum speaker today that we are gifted and blessed to have with us, Professor Devon Carbado. Professor Carbado is a professor of law at UCLA, and I want to make sure I get this right. He is also the Associate Vice Chancellor of Bruin-X for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and he is the Honorable Ari Pregerson Professor of Law at UCLA School of Law. He's going to be speaking today and engaging us in a conversation about racism and policing in America, something that obviously goes hand in hand with what Leah Gunning-Francis was reporting about in her book. And I also encourage you to stick around because at 3 o'clock this afternoon, we here at All Saints are going to be hosting the Diocese of Los Angeles' MLK celebration, and Professor Carbado will be giving a meditation in that event too. And so I'm going to sit down and bring him up here and just say it is a blessing to have you here, sir. Will you please welcome to All Saints Church, Professor Carbado.
Good morning, everyone. It really is my pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to engage you in this way. So thank you very much for that gracious and generous introduction. So the subject of my comments is race and policing. I understand that part of the project of this forum is to get us to think collectively, critically, carefully, robustly, collegially about a pressing matter of public concern. And it seems to me that race and policing fits the bill. I should be clear at the outset to also say, though, that I think we can have a conversation about race and policing that does not have as an entailment the demonization of police officers. In fact, I think it's a mistake when we frame the question of race and policing as a problem that derives from individual police officers engaging in individual acts of violence against individual African Americans. I think the problem is more systemic than that. And we think about how King engages on questions of inequality. He focused, to be sure, on the extent to which we might need to engage in individual acts of transformation. That's perfectly true. But he also wanted us to think about social change at the level of institutions, social change at the level of culture, social change at the level of law. So it's not just about finding bad apples. It's about engaging the problem more systemically. And that's precisely what I want to invite us to do today. As a point of departure, I also want to suggest that though my comments will be focused primarily on the race and policing problem as it impacts the African American community, it's critical that we understand that race and policing is a multiracial problem. We could be talking about race and policing and indigeneity. We could be talking about race and policing in Asian American communities. We could be talking about race and policing in the context of the war on terror. We could be talking about race and policing in Asian American communities. It's really critical that we understand that these questions are terribly, terribly complex, and I'm opening up space for a conversation about its impact on particular community. So I want to take up this question first and foremost by asking a seemingly abstract question. What's in a frame? And I want to ask this question because it seems to me that how we frame a social problem structures, if not determines, how we think about solutions. So I want to invite you to consider that with respect to the problem of race and policing, we need to think both big and small. Both big and small. So what might I mean by that? Well, I want to take up that question by asking you to think not about people but cows. So you might say, Devon, that's crazy. What's going on, to ask the Marvin Gaye question? We're talking about race and policing, and I'm asking you to think about cows. Please explain. So I'm a board member of the African American Policy Forum, and when we give presentations on race, we sometimes ask people to consider this particular image. It's an image that comes from the Frameworks Institute that we play around with in a particular kind of way. And the exercise goes something like this. I tell you that the cows are sick. So we're stipulating that the cows are sick. And then the question becomes, why are the cows sick? And typically we would engage in a conversation, and if past is prologue, your responses to that question would track the kind of responses I typically get. So one set of responses focuses on the cows themselves. The cows are sick because of something the cows are doing to themselves or something the cows are failing to do for themselves. The cows are failing to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, let's say. So it's kind of a blame the cows narrative. That's one set of responses. Now, another set of responses focuses on the farmer. The cows are sick because the farmer doesn't like the cows. The farmer prefers the chickens, let's say. The farmer, it turns out, is a cowcist, analogous to a racist. So I think you get the idea. One set of responses focuses on the cows. Another set of responses focuses on the farmer. But if we pull back the frame, we begin to see the cows are going to be sick because they exist in a toxic environment. Which is to say, quite apart from what the cows are doing or failing to do for themselves, quite apart from what the farmer is doing vis-a-vis the cows are going to be sick. This doesn't mean that we're unconcerned with whether the farmer is a nasty little cowcist. We want to know that information, to be sure. But that's an under-inclusive way of thinking about the problem. That's just like looking for a nasty little racist cop. We want to know if they're there, to be sure, but they cannot be the primary way in which we think about the problem. We have to ask ourselves, what is the bigger way of looking, which is precisely what this frame invites us to do. So that is what I might mean by thinking big. What about thinking small? What might I mean by thinking small? Well, in a way that requires us to move from the level of the individual to the mind, and for us to take up very seriously the problem of implicit bias. So some of us know something about this phenomenon, and the easiest way to have a conversation about a phenomenon that in some respect is quite technical. It's social psychologists who developed this idea of implicit bias. So I want to be sure that we understand what it might mean, how it might be manifested in the context of policing, and then again, I want to pull back and think big. So implicit bias is best understood first and foremost as something that derives from automatic processing. So we navigate the social world every day, and we don't think about every single thing we do. That would create a kind of social gridlock. So for example, if I were to ask you to identify these particular objects, you say, it's a chair. You didn't have to think about it. They're not exactly the same kind of chair, to be sure, but you recognize all of them as chairs. If I would ask you a second question, what kind of associations do you form with respect to chairs? Presumably you would have an answer there too. You sit on a chair. If you're Tom Cruise, you might stand on a chair. But you get the idea. You have these particular associations that you form with respect to chairs. The problem, in a way, is that we also automatically process people. So that if I show you this particular image of me, well, you automatically process me. Or to use the language of millennials, you hashtag me, right? So these are the hashtags. Hashtag black, hashtag male, hashtag professional. Right? This is an automatic process. I'm not going to ask you whether that was true for you. I know it's true for you. It's not like you looked at me and said, hey, there's a white guy standing before you. You automatically marked me in a particular way, whether you wanted to or not. That just happened. But things get slightly more complex in the sense that automatic processing can take the form of attitudes on the one hand and stereotypes on the other. So let's be clear about what these two terms might concretely mean. So with respect to attitudes, the question is not whether I have an attitude in this picture as I stand before you. Attitudes mean whether you evidence warmth or not towards a particular person or group. Do you like or dislike a particular person or group? Do you give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down? That's roughly what we're thinking about when we think through the question of attitudes. Stereotypes are slightly different. Stereotypes are group generalization. I won't ask you to give me your stereotypes, because then it would require you to engage in something that might run afoul of your PC-ness. So I won't ask you to do that. But there are stereotypes that we all know exist and that people traffic in different kinds of ways. So for example, with the African American, there's a stereotype of the dancer, the stereotype of the athlete. Now, it turns out that I might want to claim these particular stereotypes. My kids will tell me that they don't apply. I might want to claim them. The broader point is that we have these stereotypes of people. Now, crucially, stereotypes and attitudes don't necessarily travel in the same direction. They can be positive and negative. So, for example, I might dislike Asian Americans. That's an attitude, but think that they are smart. That's a stereotype. Conversely, I might like African Americans. That's an attitude, and think that they're dangerous. That's a stereotype. So let's think again why we might be concerned with implicit biases over and against explicit biases. So explicit biases are biases that we have and we know and we typically own. Right? So we know our explicit biases. Implicit biases are more complicated in the sense that if I ping my brain and say, tell me whether I have implicit biases on a particular group, I'm not going to get an answer. And that poses a problem. Because if we can't get to our implicit biases by way of introspection, We have to get at them somewhere. The question is how. The short answer is social psychologists have figured out a way for us to measure our implicit biases, and that is the matter to which I will now turn. So there's a test called the implicit association test. Any of you have taken that test, by the way? All right, so not many of you. You will promise, after this presentation, you will go home and you will take this test. So let me give you a sense of what this test might be like by asking you to indulge another test. Now, this particular test will require your participation. So before I go on, you have to tell me that you're going to participate. Are you going to participate? Yes. All right, that was a pretty robust yes. So let's carry on. It's a really easy task, I promise. All you have to do is identify the colors. So for example, if I said identify the colors in column 1, you would simply shout out green, red, purple, green, column 2, blue, yellow, blue, red. You get the idea. So with respect to this particular chart, that's what I want you to do. So after 3, I want you to just shout out the colors as quickly as you can in column 1. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. All right, I know you're all saints. You can do better than that. So louder and quicker, column 2. Now I'm beginning to feel the church. Column 3. That was excellent. You all have A's. So I promise you, one more time, and then we'll stop. So again, just focus on the colors. Just shout out the colors as quickly as you can. So column 1, shout out the colors. Wow. You started with an A and you lost it right away. That sounds like a line Julie Andrews might sing. So, red. What's the color? Green. But you all got it wrong. All right. The 1% got it right. Bruins in the house. All right. Fair enough. So again, to ask the Marvin Gaye question, what's going on? What's going on? Someone, anyone, tell me, what's going on? But what? Why difficult to hear? What's the problem? It's a mismatched story. So there's a problem. When the word and the color diverge, that creates grit for us. When the word and the color converge, that's like grease. We can go through that smoothly, easily. It's not a problem. It turns out that the implicit association test trades on that basic idea. When concepts match, we're good. When concepts mismatch, we're not so good. So here's the mechanics of the test. You're sitting in front of your computer. The computer says, look, you see this image of a white person, press a left key. You see this image of a black person, press a white key. You see these particular words, beauty, gift, happy, joy, press the right key. You see these particular words, filth, pain, hurt, sick, press the left key. What the computer is doing is testing your reaction time. It's trying to figure out how quickly do you associate whites with the positive words? How quickly do you associate blacks with the negative word? So to think about it this way, it's like the computer is constructing 2 big races. So in the first race, we're thinking about how quickly do we associate black people with beauty in comparison to white people with beauty. It turns out whites win that race. The next race, how quickly do we associate black people with filth in comparison to white people with filth? Black people win that race. That's the story of implicit bias. That's the way it gets constructed. Another way to think about what I'm saying is to invoke the idea of schema consistency when things seem to go together, and schema inconsistency. So to be more concrete about it, associating white people with beauty and black people with filth, that's a schema-consistent thing in our minds. Against a backdrop of histories of racism and social meanings about race, this just gets embedded in deep and profound ways that we're not even mindful of. This, on the other hand, is a schema inconsistent move, by which I mean this is not our default in our head. Our default is not to associate black people with beauty in our heads, is the way I want to put it. To think about this another way, to go back to colors, we can make the point by simply saying identifying black people with good, that's like identifying the color red in the word green. That's a mismatch moment for us. You get the idea, I think. Now, in some ways, I want to suggest, we don't need social psychologists to tell us about implicit bias. It's, in many ways, a part of our racial common sense. So what do I mean by this? Who recalls these images? Some of you recall these images. Some of you might not. These images circulated in the context of Hurricane Katrina, for those of you who might not be able to see them very clearly. So one figures a black person in water with a bag with stuff. The other figures a white person or white people in water with a bag with stuff. So you might say, descriptively, nothing different about these people in those bodies of water. Turns out that they were captioned very differently. So the black person is looting, and the white person is finding. Why? Why? Where does that come from? I don't need implicit bias association test to tell me that something is happening here that relates, again, to the social meaning of race. And if I flip the script, it doesn't quite stick in the same way. That's precisely what, again, implicit bias is all about. Let's turn now to this. This is a real headline from a real newspaper, not in 1920. So we can all unpack that, I think. America beats foreigner. Who's the foreigner? It's Michelle Kwan. And to make matters worse, the Seattle Times in 2002 reproduces the same racial faux pas. And what's particularly interesting about this is that in 1998, Seattle Times says, how could you possibly do that, MSNBC? What is wrong with you retrograde people? So clearly we know that this is not a moment in which the Seattle Times is thinking Michelle Kwan is not an American. That's not what it's about. It's the normalization of particular ideas about race that are so embedded that our defaults reproduce it almost naturally, as it were. So the crucial thing to recognize then is that all of us have these biases. 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 It's a really important point of departure. The biases are a function of socialization process. And again, clearly in this moment, I'm thinking small. And I want to emphasize that because we're going to pull again the curtain back and think big in just a minute. But it's really important for us to recognize that the problem of race is not always a problem of intentionality. There's an awful lot of intentional racial discrimination, to be sure. I'll come back to that point in a minute. But it's crucial that we recognize that to exist in a society that socializes us every day via media, etc., to think about race in a particular kind of way means that it becomes embedded literally in our cognitive processes in ways that could reproduce themselves in everyday social interactions. So if you don't, again, believe me about just how pervasive this phenomenon is, I urge you to go to Project Implicit Bias, which is housed at Harvard. You've already promised to take an implicit association test. I'm sure the church will follow up on you and ask you next Sunday whether or not you did. But just to give you a sense as to how pervasive this is. So there are a bunch of tests. So not just on race, on sexual orientation, on class, and religious. I mean, the same results are reproduced over and over again. So I want to start with age for a minute. So it turns out that everyone, no matter what your age is, the younger, the older, I won't say the old, I'll say the older, No, we all show these biases. You might think that, well, to the extent that you're 65, you're not going to evidence bias against your own group, surely, implicitly. In fact, you do. And you might even think that, okay, you're 25. At some point, you hope to be 65, so you're motivated not to show bias. In this respect, age works differently than race. It's not like today a white person would say, you know what? 10 years from now, I'm going to be a black person. So I'm really motivated to do the right thing vis-a-vis black people. That doesn't happen with race, but it happens with age. And notwithstanding that possible trajectory story that you can tell yourself with respect to age, it's still the case that you evidence these biases. So if I went up and down all of this, so moving again from age, race, sexual orientation, weight, disability, each of these are moments in which we show bias in favor of the normative group. So, straight people over LGBTQ people, young people over old people, Christians over Muslims, able-bodied over disabled, right? These biases are captured. And again, you can just go on this site to see the amount of data they have amassed to instantiate this point. And the last one goes to weapons. Turns out we associate black people with weapons more than we do white people. And what's really interesting about these particular studies, the weapons about which I speak are not guns and knives. We're talking like Game of Thrones-like weapons. So in the psych, we, black people, are associated with Games of Thrones-like weapons. Why? Because it's more a story about dangerousness than it is a story about the particular weapon. It's not an empirical story. It's a story about social meanings of race. Now, I mentioned already that implicit bias is not the only story. And so it turns out in these particular experiments that if you wire people up to a machine and you say, look, do not lie. We have a pipeline to your soul. We will know if you're telling the truth. You get an awful lot of sexist stuff out of people, an awful lot of racist stuff out of people. In other words, it's an incentive for us to conceal our biases because we know that moral opprobrium attaches to us to the extent that we express them. So I do not, even as we're thinking small, I do not want to leave you with the impression that it is my sense that the problem of implicit bias is the only thinking small problem. There are intentional racists. I could just say, see the person who sits in the White House, but I won't do that because I didn't come here to be political, which is kind of disingenuous because I just acted political. but I digress. So I've suggested that we ought to be thinking big and small with respect to how we think about the problem of policing. And as I go on with this question of frame, I want to remind you that the problem of policing is also gendered in deep and profound ways. So as I continue with the rest of my talk, imagine that the subjects of the problems that I'm describing transcend men and includes blackness in its multiplicity of ways. So just please be sure to keep that in mind. So let me now offer up a way, the thinking big way, of understanding how police violence might operate. And even though I'm saying I want you to think big, I'm just going to address one piece of the problem. So here's what I mean. I'm trying to answer the question again about why are African Americans vulnerable to police violence. And it seems to me that there's a crucial part of this story, of this phenomenon, that we have to have in mind. And my surmise is that it will gel with your own intuition. Here's what I mean. Repeated police interactions exposes African Americans to the possibility of violence, of police violence. That is to say, if people are not having contact with the police to begin with, they're outside of the zone of police violence. So a necessary move to understand police vulnerability to police violence is understanding why are people having these police contact moments to begin with. Because if you're outside of the zone of police contact, you're outside of the zone of police violence. So what I want to do in the rest of my time is just offer a few ways, and this is an under-inclusive list. But I want to talk about biases, masculinization, and predatory policing as three social forces, if you like, that play an enormously important role putting African Americans in contact with the police in ways that then creates conditions of possibility for police violence. Again, this is an inexhaustive list, but these 3 items are important. So to begin with the biases story, I've already suggested that we all have biases. And if it's the case that you perceive a group to be violent and dangerous, it stands to reason that you will focus your law enforcement attention on that particular group. Now, I want to focus on a particular study that speaks to this particular question, but I want to just pause and remind you that the reason I'm turning to social science in this moment, the reason I'm thinking specifically about social psychology is precisely because Dr. King himself made absolutely clear that the social sciences ought to play a role shaping our level of consciousness about how race is operating. And this particular piece, which he wrote, The Role of the Behavioral Scientist in the Civil Rights Movement, I think is a really useful piece for you to understand why academia is critical to projects of social transformation. It's not the most important outfit, to be sure, but knowledge production has something to say about on-the-ground inequalities. King recognized this, and he encouraged, again, social scientists to take up the question of racial inequality and to allow that to shape the trajectory of civil rights reform. So the particular study that I want to discuss with you is a study that one of my co-authors produced, and the basic study goes something like this. Here's what they're trying to figure out. Can we establish empirically that people form associations between race and crime, so that when they're thinking about black people, they're thinking about crime. And when they're thinking about crime, they're thinking about black people. Can we demonstrate that empirically? So that we're not making an ideological argument, we're not making a normative argument, we're making a social scientific argument. Can we do that? And here's how they did it. So imagine that you're sitting in front of your computer screen, and you're looking at the screen, but you do not know that you've seen a picture of a black male face. You do not know that you've seen a picture of a white male face. Social psychologists are sneaky. Lawyers get bashed up all the time. I think we should pay attention to the sneaky social psychologist. So you're watching this computer and you do not know that you've been exposed to an image. So one image is of a black male face that some people are exposed to. Another image is of a white male face. And the third condition, you've not seen any face at all. And again, the reason you don't see this is because the images appear before you too quickly. They're in and out, and you just don't know that you've been exposed. You've been, quote unquote, primed. That's the specific term. So the object of this experiment is for you to identify particular objects. And there are 2 specific objects that you have to identify. So one object is a handcuff. Can you figure out that this is a handcuff? Everyone recognizes a handcuff, yes? The other object is an iron. You recognize this as an iron? It's all easy. When I teach this materials to my students, I have to explain that the iron is an iron. They have no idea what it is. Like, it's not some prehistoric tool, it's an iron. You know, I don't know what's going on with these kids, but you get the idea. So you might say, well, Devon, that's easy. I can identify the handcuff. I can identify the iron. What's hard about this? You said social psychologists are sneaky. I don't buy it. What's hard? What's hard is that the objects appear before you at different levels of degradability. So concretely, this is frame 1. It's hard to figure out what that is at frame 1. Look now at frame 25. Some of you can probably see what it is. At frame 41, you can probably see, to the extent that you're sight privileged, you can see that that's a gun. Right? So the object appears at different frames. At frame 1, probably can't figure it out. At frame 41, probably can figure it out. So here's the question. At what frame do you identify the iron as the iron as a result of being primed with the black male face, the white face, or the no face at all? At what frame do you identify the handcuffed as the handcuffed as a result of being primed with those 3 conditions. Everyone following? So we're trying to see, does being exposed to a black face affect when you see the object? Does being exposed to a white face affect when you see the object? Again, everyone with me? Yes. All right, so let's look at the results. So if you look at the y-axis, that's the number of frames, right? That's when you see the object. The x-axis are the three conditions, the white face, the black face, or the no face at all. So let's see the results. So these are the results for the ion, right? The object that my kids have no idea what it is. Those are the results. And what you see here is there is no difference. So if you prime me with a white face, if you prime me with a black face, if you prime me with no face, I kind of identify the ion at the same space, 23/24 bars. Everyone got that? That's the results. You don't need to be an empiricist. You just look at the height of the bar. All right, let's look at the crime-relevant object. Okay, so this is different, it's fair to say. So if we focus first on the white prime, it's like, it's not a gun, 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 it's okay, finally, it's a gun. If you focus on the black face, it's a gun. There's a difference, and it's helpful to think again about these two results as compared to the middle. Right? So the middle is ostensibly the neutral position, because under that condition, you haven't really seen or been exposed to any particular face. Right? So when you compare the other two, you might say that whiteness inhibits your capacity to see the gun. It stands in the way. I don't want to believe it's a gun when I'm primed with a white. And blackness facilitates your capacity to see the gun. So there are lots of experiments on this point that, again, demonstrate the ways in which race might be deeply embedded in our cognitive processes in ways that produce this particular outcome. And significantly for our purposes, police officers were themselves a part of this particular experiment. So this wasn't just conducted with students in schools. Officers were a part of the results. So I've talked about biases. Sure. So I've talked about biases. So what I want to do now is focus on masculinization, and then I will stop. So the basic idea with respect to masculinization is people are vulnerable to being criminalized for relatively minor stuff. So here's the list: spitting in public, loitering, sleeping in public, jaywalking, removing trash from a bin. The point I want to end on here is that one can talk about this as the criminalization of poverty. And to the extent that these acts are being criminalized, it's easy for police officers to have probable cause to stop people. So this is not a story about a cop just being willy-nilly nasty or racist. This empowers police officers to mobilize probable cause in ways that results in police conduct that can produce violence. We could talk a lot more, it seems to me, about other variables that are at play. What I'm trying to suggest is that when we think about the problem of race and policing, it is critically important that we have these broader social structures in place. So I'll stop here. I know we don't have any time for questions, apparently, but I really appreciate your time and patience.
So, yeah, first of all, thank you. A couple things. You didn't get through everything you wanted to do here, and we need to hear it. So will you come back? Okay, thank you. Thank you. We really need you to have come back. So thank you very much. Just two reminders. First of all, we all promised to take the implicit bias test. This is something we've already started working on with our staff here. I've put it on my Facebook page. I put the link on there. We will get it. Susan's working on it right now. On the All Saints page, we're going to make sure the link to Project Implicit is where everyone can see it. Please, today, it doesn't take very long, there's a whole bunch of them, go take the test. And then again, remember the books are for sale here. Both Professor Carbado's book and Dr. Leah Gunning-Francis's book are here. Thank you all for being here. And remember, if you want to hear more, 3 o'clock today is the Diocesan MLK celebration right here at All Saints Church. Thank you to everyone who's been streaming with us. God bless you all.